And welcome, I'm Philippa Haynes.
And I'm Mark Lee. Welcome to another episode of the Accountant Success Secrets podcast. This is where we showcase and celebrate successful accountants who've been running their own practice for a good few years and whose stories can inspire and encourage other accountants in practice around the UK.
Yes, we asked them to share their story, including the highs, the lows, and what they've learned on the way. Our aim is to provide some fundamental insights for you, our loyal listener. So if you would like to share your story in a similar way, please do get in touch with Mark or myself.
Our podcast today is supported by the Tax Advice Network. Their website exists to enable you to find exactly the right tax specialist whenever a client's tax issue, challenge or problem demands a second opinion, or when you want to avoid going beyond your level of competence and experience. It costs nothing to use the website, where you'll find tax experts addressing over 100 areas of tax. Just choose the advisor you want and contact them directly through the website. Simply visit taxadvicenetwork.co.uk to find out more.
Right, so today on our podcast we are delighted to introduce Tas Mustafa, founder of Barnes & Scott, the first firm in London to specialise in tech, digital and fintech startups. Tas has more than 10 years experience in advising startups ranging from app developers, Saas businesses, digital media and cyber security to ad tech, health tech, smart city and gaming studios. Whew. And he has grown the practice to 150 clients served by a core team of 10 plus external advisors called on as and when necessary.
Welcome, Tas. Delighted to have you here. Is there anything else you'd like to add by way of intro?
No, I think that's everything. That's great.
Well, as you know, we aim to keep the podcast to around 30 minutes, and we do that by focusing the discussion around a few key questions. Normally, I start with a combination question, but you specifically asked that we didn't do that, so I'll ask 3 quick questions before passing over to Philippa. There we go. Always looking to help our interviewees. So the first one is, what attracted you to start your own practice?
Well, I guess I'll take it a step back and look at sort of why I went
Sure.
into accounting in the first place. So as we were growing up, my parents were quite keen for their kids to go into a sort of professional environment. I mean, my dad was in business himself and had a restaurant, but my parents were quite keen for their kids to sort of be, I don't know, an accountant or a doctor or something like that. And so I was the youngest of 3, and I was quite fortunate in that my sister went into accounting and my brother went into medicine. So by the time it came around to me, the pressure was off and I could kind of had a bit more free reign about what I wanted to do. But I mean, I didn't really, have much of a clue at that age. And, I ended up sort of following in my sister's footsteps, really, and studying accounting, economics and accounting at university. And then following that, sort of took a year out to sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and decided to pursue accounting because I thought it would be a good profession, and again, kind of following in from what my sister was doing. And I remember applying for the top 4 accounting firms and not getting very far. And then I applied for the top, started applying for the top 10 firms, and again, not getting very far. And by the time I got to the top 50 firms, I thought something's not quite right here. So I switched direction and went into financial services, worked in the city for a bit. But there was this one role that I really liked, which was training in audit at the National Audit Office. And so I reapplied for that role whilst working in my other job, and managed to get it second time round. And so that was quite a big turning point for me. Got that role in 2007, and then in 2010 I qualified, and then in 2012, pretty much on the day that I was eligible to apply for a practicing certificate, I did, and started my business from there.
Wow. And what was it that attracted you to start your own practice?
I guess it was a combination of things. I mean, I took inspiration from my family, having been in business in the past. I knew that, you know, I'm not a very sort of corporate person, and I knew that I wouldn't really get very far in the organisation where I was, and I just liked the idea of, you know, having my own business, being my own boss, and just creating something of value where I can kind of hire people and create value to the economy, essentially, and so, you know, that's what sort of drew me to that. I mean, I have no business training, learned, you know, what I could off the TV and from our first few clients, really.
And how were you able to service those clients, not having worked in practice before? How did you generate the confidence amongst prospective clients, or were you just, you know, taking anyone and everyone at whatever fees and that sort of stuff?
No, so the first few clients were pretty much friends and family.
Very common.
There were, yeah, and you know, I guess I was doing simple tax returns and things like that. So it wasn't anything where I was completely out of my depth. And the first sort of few clients we had were in the medic profession through my family connections. And also, fortunately, one of our first clients was in the tech sector, and it was a small startup that my father-in-law had invested in, and they were looking for an accountant, and it was kind of basically the learning ground from there, really. And we figured out fairly quickly that the tech sector was where we wanted to be, we went from there.
Brilliant.
Just pulling you back again to something you said. You said that you weren't very corporate, and so you knew that you weren't going to get very far in a corporate environment. Just tell us a bit about that, because it's interesting then to see you go off and become the owner of your own business. What did you see in yourself that wasn't going to work, and what do you think, you know, was working as a business owner? Because it's quite a big step, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I did make the step. I took various risks, but they were quite calculated and strategic. So I didn't sort of just leave my job and move into my own business. I set up the practice with permission of my employer, and did that for the first couple of years whilst working full time in the first job. And I ended up then going part-time and eventually full-time in about 2015, so about 3 years after starting. But I think when you're in one of those big kind of corporate roles, there's lots of hierarchy, there's lots of politics, you've kind of got to play the game and things like that. You've got to do, you know, often in an audit capacity, you have to sort of box ticking things where you know you're not adding value, but it has to be done. And so, you know, a combination of all of those led me to think, well, I can do something better with myself than just kind of, you know, follow this path, which may not necessarily be the best thing for me. So
that's great.
I think that's fab, and I think, you know, that point about having the permission of your employer to do something else alongside the job, then going part-time whilst you're building up the practice. It's a luxury. Not everybody is able to start like that, but it's really helpful to hear that was the origins of Barnes and Scott. And before I pass over to Philippa again, you know, should just clarify, where did the name Barnes and Scott come from?
Yeah, so the name is completely made up. So me and my wife sort of sat down one evening with a piece of paper and wrote down various names that we thought sounded quite posh. We put them together in various combinations. You know, did a Google search to see that they weren't taken already, and we settled on that. But it's similar to companies like, I don't know, Haagen-Dazs or whatever, the ice cream company, where that's actually just a made-up word. It just sounds like a posh ice cream. So that's where we took our inspiration from. And we went with it. And it's been working well ever since, really, because we did ask the clients a couple of years ago when we were thinking about rebranding, and we said, you know, what do you think? Should we stick with the name or go with, like, I don't know, Rocket Accounts or something like that? I had a better name. And everyone liked the original Barnes and Scott, sort of old school sounding name. So we stuck with that.
Yeah. Okay. It is interesting, isn't it? That you were looking for something posh. Tell me a bit about that. Just kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just helps open the doors, in certain places. I mean, if you see, I don't know, that name, coming through, it sounds like it's got lots of heritage, and I think it helps.
I love the fact that nowhere at no time have you ever claimed that the practice is older than when you started it, but it's sort of almost implied by the name, but without you making any fallacious claims. So I think that's very clever. You must love the fact that they made it up completely, Philip.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. No, but it sounds lovely, and it looks good as well. So tick for that. So what have you learned along the way then, Taz? Because it's obviously a big journey, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we've learned lots, really. I mean, I'd never worked in practice, so I pretty much learned everything along the way. But there's been lots of, I think, our progress has been sort of quite steady. So there's not been these kind of like big highs and big lows, and massive mistakes that we've made or massive gains. And that's kind of been on purpose. We're just trying to grow at around 15% a year, which doubles your business every 5 years. And so, yeah, I mean, there's lots we've learned. I mean, one of the key things is we've learned to have a real focus on our core area and not to branch out into too many others, because it is quite tempting. I mean, in a way, we've sort of narrowed the pool, because I think in the introduction we talked about various sectors, but really what we focus on is technology startups. And even though we don't necessarily say no to other clients, and we do have clients in other sectors. So, for example, we've got clients in the gyms, we've got a few gyms on the books. We don't then change our branding and positioning to say we're tech sector and fitness sector. So I think that's the confusing message. So we just focus on the one sector and try and do that really, really well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm all about kind of not necessarily niching, but being very clear about who you want to work with. And obviously it started with you with, the first business that was tech based, and then obviously there was something about that you enjoyed, and so you've then focused specifically on that. What was it that you enjoyed? Can you remember?
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting business actually, and the founder was very different to everyone we've ever worked with since. I remember he asked me a question that I didn't know how to answer at the time, and now I would know. I think he said something like, and this is a very technical accounting point, but he said something like, can we use cash basis accounting for like part of our balance sheet and accrual basis accounting for another? And obviously the answer was no, but at the time I didn't know what to say, and I sort of like tried to find a middle ground. But yeah, I mean, I think with tech companies, it's a really, really good place to be as an advisor, because those companies tend to have their heads screwed on. They often have funding, which is great. They're often interested in the numbers, and they're often trying to grow the business, not just maintain it, but grow it. So it's a really great place. It's a really great ride to join, because you can see some really big, gains and movements and things like that. And there's that statistic about startups, and most of them fail and things like that. But the companies that we work with, most of them don't fail, because they're in that bracket where they're switched on enough to seek an accountant early on and pay for their services and advice. And I think that means that they tend to do better in the long term.
And not just find an accountant, they've come to the specialists. Because, as you say, they tend to be funded, so they tend to have funds in order to be able to pay for decent advice. Because they're growing, there's share scheme issues, funding issues, investment issues, and a whole range of areas where you give specialist tax advice. as well. And I'm sure that you pick up not just startups from scratch, but those who've realised that their first choice of accountant, who was cheap, didn't actually have the expertise to give them the advice that they needed. Does that happen too?
Yeah, it's really common. So quite often we'll have a startup, and the first accountant is always somebody who they know, or who their dad, who was like their dad's accountant or something like that. It's always something like that, and they work with them for a couple of years, and they then, not necessarily outgrow them, but then they then come to a firm that's more experienced in working with startups that are receiving funding and are issuing share options and are looking to grow. So that's where we do find ourselves in that situation quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing some work for an accountant that was looking at sort of really targeting proper kind of entrepreneurial, those sorts of businesses that you're talking about. And, they have to be really nimble themselves, as an accountant. They have to be able to sort of turn around and work with the data almost real time, because these businesses are growing super quickly. And also, if there are investors involved, they want to know how their money's being spent. And so, there's always going to be those moments where you've got to report out and stuff. So it's quite labour intensive, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, don't get me wrong, we like the slow and steady startups too. We like the ones that are sort of, not just growing rapidly. So it's nice to have a balanced portfolio. So you've got the high growth ones, because those can also fail quite quickly. So I remember at one point I was thinking, we had a really big client. I thought, well, we just need 10 of those clients. We don't need 50 clients. We can just have 10 of those, we'll be fine. But actually, having a range is really good, because it gives you experience in wider areas. It means that you can focus on the really fast growing ones, but also leaves you enough time to work with the other clients as well. So we wouldn't want all high growth tech. I mean, we want all tech, but not all high growth scale ups. Sometimes you just want maybe a steady business as well that you can support. So it's good to have a wide range.
Yeah.
And related to that, how have you transitioned from you and your wife to a small team, larger team, 10 of you now, plus external advisors as well? How's that journey gone?
So my wife joined about 5 years ago, but so I started the business pretty much on my own and kind of learnt the ropes as I was going, and each time I learnt something, I would then hire someone and pass it on to them so I could see how it worked, kind of thing. So a lot of the processes that we do internally are sort of I've done and learnt, and then hired someone to help do that, and it means that I've kind of understand how the business works really well. Perhaps it's maybe slowed down our growth because of sort of getting involved in the detail a bit too much, but I mean, so we've hired through various ways. LinkedIn's been quite successful for us. We tend to hire globally, so we look for the best person for that position. Don't necessarily look at where they're located, but often we'll hire people who have perhaps been trained in the UK and then have moved abroad, or perhaps who have been trained by a bigger firm abroad and has sort of got the necessary skills and experience. So we've just sort of grown, one employee a year sort of thing is roughly what we're trying to do. Yeah, I mean, that's worked pretty well.
And have you always been, well, actually, I know the answers to some of these questions because I've worked with Tas for a long time. Talk about the journey in terms of being a remote team since long before the lockdown and pandemic and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so we've always been a remote team. Started off as a factor of cost. Didn't want to pay for an office, but also not everybody was based in London anyway, so it didn't really make sense. Made good use of the ICAW meeting rooms and things like that. I think at the start, I did sort of dream of having an office. I thought, oh, that'd be great. One day we'll have this nice office and we'll come in and, do office stuff. but things were progressing quite well without an office, and over time you start to think, well, we've got this far without an office, do we need one, and so on. I mean, we use various co-working spaces and things like that, and most of the team have access to a co-working space locally to them if they need, so people can get out of the house and things. But in terms of a proper office in London, that's not something we have. And then when COVID hit, we were perfectly placed to just carry on working as normal, and we had everything set up already. We already had Zoom, we had Slack, so we were communicating. We probably communicated more with our clients during COVID because we were using Zoom more than before. So coming out of that, we still don't really see a need for a physical office, and being remote, whilst it does have a lot of challenges, works really well for us, and I don't think will hinder our progress as a business.
That makes sense.
Sounds great. So in terms then, mistakes, we've made a few over the years. I mean, what would you say you've learned along the way, the mistakes in particular?
I think, as I said, we haven't had these huge sort of calamities or anything like that, but made lots of little mistakes along the way, make them most weeks. One sort of repeated mistake we made at the start was on the recruitment side of things, which I know is quite common. The key thing for us has been learning what's gone wrong, writing down what to do better next time, and then actually implementing it. And so we've got to a really good place now where our recruitment process, I think, is pretty good. But mistakes we've made in the past have been things like not doing a test, or like not testing out the person, not doing a trial or something like that, for example. And also being a bit too reactive, so basically waiting for someone to leave before we replace them, which obviously puts you on the back foot. Whereas when you have a team of 10 or more, there's always going to be someone who's going to move on once a year or something. It's just normal. So being a bit more proactive and thinking about that 6 months before it happens rather than the day after.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice.
Yeah. And Tas is not my only client where I've recognised that somebody's going to be leaving before the owner of the practice has, just from hearing the stories about what's going on, and then saying, I think you're going to need to make that decision just listening to what you're saying about them. And I've told you before, you're absolutely not the only one to have done that. It doesn't happen now, which is wonderful.
Yeah. So what are the processes that you've put in place then? Just for those who are listening, some specifics. So obviously recruit early before you actually need.
We'll start the process early. Yeah, because it takes ages. Basically, you're not going to find somebody in a week. It takes 3 to 6 months. So start the process early. Have a really good job description. Have a process whereby it's sort of like advert goes out. Pick top 10 people. You give them a written exercise, and then we do 2 interviews with different members of the team, so we have different perspectives, and then put that all in a pot together, and then make a judgment call essentially at the end of it. But at the start, I was just interviewing somebody without a test and based on their CV, and I think that doesn't give you a full view of what somebody's going to be like to work with. Also, trialing people where you can is important. Not always possible with people's sort of employments and things like that, but that's always useful to see as well.
Yeah, great advice. I love that. I mean, I think I've heard of quite a few people, certainly on LinkedIn, bemoaning the fact they're really struggling with their recruitment. But I mean, it sounds like you've really got the process down to a fine art, which is fantastic.
Well, we're still continually building the process, and that's the key thing. Is like, don't rest on our laurels. Just make sure we're continually improving.
It's wonderful, and 2 recruits in recent months who are doing very well by all accounts.
Yeah, they're doing really well. Yeah, really pleased.
Yeah. So beyond your the clarity of business focus on new tech startups and growing tech businesses based in or around London, what else would you say singles out your practice and helps you attract new clients and keeping those that you already have?
I think a lot of it is down to our attitude and our sort of core values of how we work with businesses. So what we try to do is we put the client's growth as our highest priority over and above ours, which can be quite hard to do and achieve. But when companies are growing, or as people are building their businesses, at the start, often you as an accountant, you're basically be doing everything. So you're doing bookkeeping and payroll and finance. But as the companies grow from, say, 10 people to 50 to 60 people, that finance function is probably best done in-house and not outsourced to an accountant. And we would advise them and say, well, look, we think our services actually should be done by you guys, and we'll show you guys how to build a finance team in-house, and we'll train you on zero, and we'll get you guys self-sufficient on that. And so whilst that might lead to a reduction in our fees, that is what is best for their business, we believe. And so clients recognize that and appreciate that we're actually trying to help them grow. Because alongside that, we can still provide other services. We might help in a due diligence if there was an exit, or we might help. We're fully there to provide different services. So maybe tax advice, strategic advice, and things like that. But it's putting their growth first has been, I think, quite important, and clients recognise that, and that's why we get lots of referrals and things like that.
I think that is superb, and it's not something I can recall hearing from other accountants. And I think that probably is one of the secrets to your success. Any others that you think you could identify?
We've I guess I talked about the remote team, but we've got a really good team culture in place, that even though we're not in the same location, we're always chatting on Zoom and LinkedIn and on Slack. I'm really keen not to overwork the team, so I always say to them, look, if everyone's working full tilt and something's gone wrong, and we need to rein it back in again. And we have quite a flat hierarchy, so we don't have, I don't like the sort of the corporate background, I was trying to get away from the corporate side of things, so we don't have these sort of big chains of hierarchy and responsibility. We kind of all muck in, we help each other out, we delegate upwards and downwards and sideways and things like that. So we try and run the business flexibly, which works really well for the team.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it sounds like you're very nimble, very kind of modern in your approach. You've taken some of the sort of really good ways of working, from corporate or whatever, and sort of overlaid that. So it sounds to me like, you've done it in a very thoughtful way, and for that reason everybody enjoys working there, which is great.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
great stuff. Well, we've almost come to an end yet again. I say this every time, but it feels like we're just getting into the nitty gritty and we need to say goodbye. But I think really you've given us a lot of insights there, certainly about around the recruitment. I think that's on everybody's kind of list at the moment, so the more we can talk about that and bring some insights, the better. Let's just share your details, Tas, if you will, so that listeners can get in touch if they'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, probably the best place is LinkedIn, so just my profile on there, Tas Mustafa, or just on our website, www.barnesandscott.com. You can get through to there as well.
Brilliant.
Lovely.
Thank you. And Philippa, how can listeners find out more about you and Insight 101?
So I'm on LinkedIn as well, and my website is www.insight101.co.uk. And Mark, finally, how can listeners find out more about you and your Soul Practice Club?
Well, online everywhere, I'm Bookmark Lee, so I have a bookmark business card too. Find me on LinkedIn or bookmarklee.co.uk. And I tend to support accountants who run their own practice feeling isolated, frustrated, or overwhelmed. Some want one-to-one mentoring, some appreciate the camaraderie and support from my sole practice club, and a few want both.
Aha, yes. Right, okay, that's it. If you've enjoyed the Accountant Success Secrets podcast, please share the love online, subscribe and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or YouTube, and let us have your feedback too directly.
Yeah, and absolutely. All the feedback and the reviews help to broaden the reach of the podcast. I think, Philippa, you told me that we've just beaten the 2,000 downloads figure, which is fantastic. And do please contact either Philippa or myself if you would like to be interviewed on a future podcast. For now, my thanks again to Tas. Brilliant to see you here, my friend, and Philippa. And until next time on the Accountant Success Secrets podcast, or anywhere else we might meet online or in real life. Bye-bye for now.
Goodbye.
Bye.